Professor Bradford Parkinson was the chief architect for GPS and led the original advocacy for the system in 1973 as an Air Force colonel. Gaining approval, he became the first director of the GPS Joint Program Office and led the original development of spacecraft, master control station, and 8 types of user equipment. He continued leadership of the program through the extensive test validation program, including being the launch commander for the first GPS satellite launches. This original deployment of GPS demonstrated comfortable margins against all PNT requirements. Earlier in his career, he was a key developer of a modernized AC-113 gunship, introduction of which included 160 hours of combat missions. He was an instructor at the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School. In addition, he led the Department of Astronautics and Computer Science at the U.S. Air Force Academy. He retired from the U.S. Air Force as a colonel. He was appointed a professor at Stanford University in 1984 after 6 years of experience in the industry. At Stanford University, he led the development of many innovative applications of GPS. He has been the CEO of 2 companies and serves on many boards. He is the editor, author of numerous technical publications. Among his many awards are the IONS Burka, Kepler, and Thurlow Awards, the Draper Prize of the National Academy of Engineering, and the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering. He is an ION Fellow, was the first chair of the Satellite Division, and is one of the original founders of the ION GNSS Plus meeting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bradford Parkinson.
Good evening, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this virtual GNSS plenary session. I hope it's the last virtual meeting we have to have for our GNSS conference. But for my remarks this evening, I will be giving a short and somewhat expurgated history of radio navigation, and sort of as a warning, I have a few capricious excursions that are related subjects, and I find them interesting. I must give a great deal of credit to internet research, especially Wikipedia. Now, radio navigation has a very rich history. With the constraints on time, I will be omitting a huge body of history for foreign systems, such as German, British, Russian, and French, although I will touch on some of their significant advances. To start, I would like to motivate this discussion with a grim statistic. In 1926 and 1927, there were a total of 24 fatal commercial airline crashes. But in 1929, there were 51, and it killed 61 people. It actually is still the worst year on record for the number of commercial aircraft accidents. The rate of deaths was greater than 600 deaths per billion passenger miles. It turns out that is the parameter that we tend to use in judging these things. And many accidents were due to navigation problems or could have been avoided with better landing aids. But this was just at the dawn of the radio navigation age. Here's an outline of my talk today. I'd like to point out the RF pioneers, Maxwell and Marconi, show what they did, and then talk a little bit about the Titanic, which is a slight digression. It leads to a moral dilemma that you might find interesting. Then talk a little bit about one of our real pioneers, Jimmy Doolittle, some selected early systems, talk about the mainstay of aviation's navigation problems or solutions for the last 50 years, VOR, DME. And of course, I'm going to discuss just a little bit about GPS for aviation. Not going to dwell on that because many of you are already experts on that. And then I'm going to finish up with a few observations. The theoretical basis for radio navigation was created by James Clerk Maxwell, a Scotsman, and he lived a very short life, 1831 to 79, 48 years, and it was amazing what he did. He discovered the equations that govern the propagation of electromagnetic waves through space, and here are those equations. Vector calculus. I understood them at one time. I must say I don't understand them as well anymore. A definitive biography, for those of you who are interested, was written by a colleague of mine, Francis Everett, a professor at Stanford. And this is the little paperback book you can get if you go on the internet. I suspect it's available through Amazon. The theory explained what happened later with the first transatlantic radio transmission by Guglielmo Marconi. And as a matter of fact, the reason that that worked was probably not well understood at the time. So here's the second hero I would like to talk about, an Italian inventor and engineer. You're perhaps somewhat familiar with Marconi for various reasons. He lived from 1874 to 1937. And as a matter of fact, in the United States, we commemorate him. There is actually a statue to him at Lamont and 16th Street, which you can find if you go to Google View. He was an experimentalist in wire telegraphy, and he filed his first patent in England because it was easier to get patents in England. And he developed the first effective system of radio communication. Of course, it was Morse code and that sort of thing, a holdover from the landline communications of dots and dashes. He did his first transatlantic wire transmission on the 12th of December, 1901, and there's a whole history that goes with this that I'm not going to get into. But unknown to Marconi, the ionosphere played an essential role in that long-range transmission because a lot of people believed that he was faking it, that he hadn't really done that. I don't personally believe that at all, but I think there is an explanation for why his system worked better, or it worked at all, in the early evening hours when the ionosphere was most intense. His invention was initially deployed on ships, who obviously had no alternatives in terms of landlines. And it turned out there was a novel written about a fleeing murderer who was actually captured in a transatlantic voyage, a book called Thunderstruck, sort of a fun book to read. And this gentleman was captured after the boat had left the port, and the murderer had assumed he was in good shape, but not so. It was also an enabler for the rapid notification of the Titanic iceberg tragedy that I'm going to discuss in a little greater detail. And Marconi was very inventive, and he had some other uses of radio waves that I'm going to highlight. And a rumor has been started that Guglielmo is really the source of the name Google, but I'm here to tell you I have had that refuted. I spoke at Google here earlier in the year, and they told me no, there was no truth to that at all. So, if you want to read more about Marconi, the man who networked the world, there's a very nice book by Mark Raboy that was written just a few years ago, and also you might want to get that. So here's the explanation of this ionosphere assistance that was given to Marconi. Receiver, transmitter, the Earth, and of course the ionosphere, we GPSers find it rather troublesome. It creates delays in signals, but it also acts as a mirror for signals in this frequency band that he was using, and probably account for why he was able to actually achieve that first milestone. Well, the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1909 was a recognition of what Marconi had done, but it also recognized a German physicist named Braun. And they were jointly awarded it, of course, Marconi because of his first successful transmission, but Braun solved a problem because his Marconi initially just hooked a spark discharge to the antenna, and that was very inefficient. And what Braun had done, and probably undoubtedly enabled the 1901 success, was produced a sparkless antenna circuit. He linked the transmitter power to the antenna circuit inductively, and that greatly focused the energy and increased the broadcasting range. And as I've mentioned, his discovery enabled Marconi to conduct that first transmission and ultimately led to the formation of the wireless technology industry that rapidly expanded in those early years. Here's a few samples of Marconi. Here he is demonstrating the apparatus he used in his first long-distance radio transmissions. That was not transatlantic, of course. Transmitter on the right and the receiver with paper tape recording on the left. And he gave a lecture to the IEEE, yes, our own IEEE, in 1901, and gave a lot of credit. And he wanted to mention the work of others. Maxwell, he highlighted, Lord Kelvin, Professor Henry, and Professor Hertz. Well, this was revered company. All four of these physicists received Nobel Prizes for what they had achieved, and also you remember some of their names because they are used for various units in IEEE or in electrical engineering. In 1922, he gave a lecture, another lecture to the IEEE, which anticipated radar. He said it should be possible to design apparatus by means of which a ship could radiate or project a divergent beam of these rays in any desired direction, and the rays, if coming across a metallic object, like another steamer or a ship, would be reflected back to a receiver screened from the local transmitter on the sending ship, and thereby immediately reveal the presence and bearing of another ship in fog. So now let me turn to my digression. This is the Titanic in a picture that was in a magazine shortly after the disaster in April of 1912, and it shows the Titanic broadcasting the distress call to at least 12 other ships. We will be focusing on two of them, the California, which was the closest ship to the Titanic, and the Carpathia, which also had a role in this particular problem. And everyone remembers what the problem was. The Titanic smashed into an iceberg. Perhaps you don't recall the details, however. The wireless operators originally used Marconi's CQD, not SOS, distress signal. CQ was the signal to stop transmission and pay attention, and the D was added to signal distress. So the California was fairly close. I'll describe that some more. And the issue is the moral dilemma, if you will. Should Californian has gone to the rescue? And the Californian, here's some of the facts that are pertinent. The Californian radioed the Titanic at 7 o'clock at night to warn of an ice field. The Californian had encountered it and nearly collided herself, and this so frightened the skipper that as soon as it became nighttime, he ordered the California to stop. It was too dangerous to proceed. And he spotted the Titanic's lights about 5 miles away. He had already broadcast a generalized message, and then he radioed the Titanic again, warning stopped and surrounded by ice. As a matter of fact, the radio signal was so strong it interrupted the Titanic's regular communication, and their reply was, shut up, I am busy. Well, the Californian shut down its wireless at 11:30, and about 10 minutes later, the Titanic struck the iceberg, which of course led to the movie and a lot of other things. The Californian was sighted from the Titanic's bridge about 25 minutes later, so they started firing distress rockets. The officers aboard the Californian spotted several rockets and called down to Captain Lord, who had gone to bed. Lord suggested Californian contact the Titanic via a Morse lamp, that's Morse code and flashing lights, and did not wake the wireless operator up. So continuing the story, Lord suggested the rockets were company signals, and some of Californian's officers believed there was probably a more serious difficulty behind those rockets. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the Titanic appeared to be leaving the area after firing a total of 8 white rockets. This was reported to Captain Lord, who did nothing. The Titanic sank about 20 minutes later. And at 3 in the morning, the officers of the Californian sighted more rockets coming from a different direction, coming from the south, and those were coming from the RMS Carpathia, who had traveled all night to try to rescue the occupants of the Titanic. At 4:15 in the morning, a shift change on the Californian, Captain Lord's boat, the wireless operator came up and asked why a ship had fired rockets earlier. And at 5:30, Captain Lord, now awake, ordered the Californian to go to Titanic's position, but he did it through a twisted, longer route instead of going directly there, presumably to avoid the ice that he could now see. The Californian arrived alongside the Carpathia, the first rescue boat, who had just finished collecting all the survivors. And after the Carpathia departed for New York, California stayed behind to continue the search, but only found wreckage. So the dilemma. Should Captain Lord have gone to investigate at night? What would you have done? Jeopardize the Californian and help the Titanic, or remain hove to and avoid the risk of striking an iceberg? Well, there were 2 official inquiries that were convened, and they officially placed the blame on Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian for his inaction during the disaster. And that verdict officially ruined both his career and his life. The Californian, interestingly, was torpedoed in 1915, and its fate was never determined. And I don't think that was there was any causal activity there, but it's interesting that it also was residing somewhere on the Atlantic, and they're not certain precisely where it is. Well, let me turn now to what Marconi invented. He did a microwave beam steering demonstration, and this was the summer of 1934, quite a few years later. He did it near his home port in Italy, and he did it aboard his own personal yacht. And the approach, as shown here in the lower right, is a particularly narrow channel. And so he rigged 2 transmitters, 2 beams, and those 2 beams shown here in red and blue, I probably should have used green instead, but red and blue represented a pathway that an antenna on the Elettra, his steamship, his personal yacht, could receive, and indicating the relative strength could determine whether to steer to the right or to the left. Very simple concept, very easily understood. So he invited British and Italian maritime experts into his cabin and then proceeded to totally curtain the pilot house so you couldn't see outside. And apparently, and he very successfully navigated into the harbor between the breakwaters that are shown there. And apparently he did not pursue this application, but you can see the first glimmers of landing systems and navigation techniques. So not only was he a pioneer of communication, he also had a pretty good understanding of how these signals could be used to navigate. There is an issue here, and in the case that he used, he had what we would call a fly-to needle, in which the arrow indicated which way you should go rather than which way you are. If it was a little dot, perhaps it could indicate, okay, you're over on the left side and have to go to the right, rather than telling you which way to steer. And this is a controversy that has occurred periodically throughout the history of radio navigation. So before we get into some of the details of or samples that I want to talk about, let's just consider what radio navigation could be. They're generally measurements from or to some kind of a beacon. They could be distances, and you do a ranging measurement by round-trip travel times with appropriate corrections or adjustments. They could be directions, and the directions could be by bearing or by radio phases, and the bearing could be from the user to the activity, or it could be the bearing that is broadcast in some manner by the radio navigation device itself. Also, in some cases, the measurement is actually velocity, that is to say, by means of a radio Doppler shift. And of course, the Navy's transit system comes to mind on that. So let's start out with bearing measurement, and in this case, radio direction finding. So you have a directive antenna on board your airplane or ship. You measure the angle of the radio station, the direction, if you will, and add in your magnetic heading, and thereby get both a relative bearing and an implied bearing on the ground. And if you get a couple of these crossing, of course, you can figure out where you are. So what happened with this particular idea? Well, Hertz, early on, we just mentioned Hertz, discovered directionality, and it was a major area of research in the early 1800s. Here is an example of the apparatus that was used in 1919. An operational prototype was tested by the U.S. Army Air Corps in 1931, and two measurements of known transmitter locations, of course, determines position. The receiving antenna size is proportional to wavelength, and it usually requires at least a quarter wavelength and usually a half, which suggests going to a higher frequency, but then the penalty was a shorter range. And initially, these devices were mechanically rather than electrically rotated. New automatic ADF can exploit the AM radio stations, and if you know where the radio transmitter is, you can tune to an AM station and, of course, use that as a signal of opportunity. A second technique, which we call VHF omni-ranges now, is a method of determining the azimuth sector relative to a transmitter. And that is very, very helpful if you're either in landing or trying to fly from one VOR to another across the country. Now, to introduce what I'd like to talk next to, I'm going to give you a second little mystery. And the mystery here is, what on earth is going on here? Black snake-like lines, and we're somewhere. What is this activity? Well, let me blow it up slightly, and you can see all those snake-like lines are lines of cars, and candidly, there's one heck of a lot of cars here. Must have transported people to do something. What on earth was it? Well, the yellow shows the crowd, and they are watching an air race, and among other planes in this race was the plane shown here. If you're an aero engineer, you shudder to look at this airplane because you right away realize this must have been very squirrely to fly because the vertical and horizontal stabilizers are so small. And indeed, it was. It was virtually a killer airplane. Mostly it was an engine with a couple of tiny wings. It was almost a presaging of the F-104, which has a lot of similar characteristics. But the point is, this was the GB, and Jimmy Doolittle won the Thompson Trophy in 1932 outside Cleveland. That was the picture, with an average speed of 252 miles per hour. So long before he got fame for the Doolittle raid and a lot of other things, he was an absolutely champion air racer. He won the magnificent sum of $4,500. I don't know what that would be today, but considerably more. So here he is. He eventually made four-star generals, and the Air Force was a part of the Signal Corps, and he was in the military. He was employed by the United States Army, and here we see him. I actually shook his hand. I know he doesn't remember me, but of course he's now dead. He died at, I think, the age of 97, if that calculation works out. So a really interesting guy. He, perhaps interesting, he went to Cal, graduated in 1922, and then went on later to get a master's degree in a very early aeronautical department at MIT in 1924. In 1927, he was the first to perform an outside loop. This puts the pilot, rather than on the inside, on the outside. You experience redouts instead of blackouts. If you've ever done any negative Gs, it's what we would call them. It's not a very comfortable experience. And in 1932, he set the world's high-speed record. Now, interesting to our narrative, he received the first aeronautical engineering doctorate ever issued in the United States, and he did that in 1925. And in particular, that was for his work on blind flying. And in 1929, as a matter of fact, he became the first pilot to take off, fly, and land an airplane using instruments alone. So Jimmy is housed in this little dome back here. He does have a safety pilot. He wasn't so foolish as to omit that part. But let's take a little closer look at what's underneath this dome. And this shows Jimmy, a couple of covers that come up over his head. And the blind flying achievement, again, was sponsored by the military, the U.S. Army. And the instruments was a newly developed Colesman altimeter, a Sperry directional gyro and artificial horizon to get the attitude of the airplane, and then radio range and a marker beacon, which had been developed, yes, right down here on his, off of his left knee. These are the standard kind of aircraft instruments, and anyone flying today would be familiar with them. It is unlikely you would be familiar with this device, though, so let's blow it up. It was a reed-based instrument, and it had these two reeds that were activated by different frequencies, and those frequencies were being broadcast, very similar to the Marconi experiment. They were being broadcast on the same frequency, but at different antennas. The two reeds, one was tuned to 65 and the other to 86 cycles. That part doesn't make much difference, but the radio signal came from the two coiled antennas, and if you had the one on the right was vibrating more, it meant you were too far over to the right, and conversely. So this became the basis for something called the low-frequency radio range. It was also sometimes called the four-course radio range, LFMF, low frequency, medium frequency, and it had a lot of other names, Adcock radio range in honor of one of the inventors, or commonly the range. And it was the main navigation system used by aircrafts for instrument flying in the 1930s and 1940s. It was replaced eventually by the VORs. I'll talk some more about those in a minute. But the interesting thing is the male pilots who flew these initially, and they had to keep up their male schedules, had flown with both these visual systems as well as an aural system that I'm going to describe in a minute. They almost universally strongly preferred this system as a technique to navigate. And the reed-based system, however, was passed over by the U.S. government, and instead they went to the audio system. You'll also show this controversy showing up here, because it isn't telling you which way to steer, it's telling you which side you're on. So it's showing you in red here the side that is off course. So here is one of those radio ranges. The station is shown. It's a substantial thing. And it was broadcasting N. This is a series of Morse code N's and a series of Morse code A's, interleaved in such a way that if you were halfway in between, you simply heard a very steady signal. A little reminder of the size of these, 4 134-foot tall antenna towers. So interesting. And this evolved, and they could modify it slightly so that, or bend the directions, so that perhaps one sector would be 80 degrees and one 100. One of the ideas, one of the standards that they always had was the north sector, this sector up here, was always broadcast as an N. So if you got a little confused, you at least had that to help you out. This went on. They did some further modifications and actually created a 12-course radio range. It was experimentally tested, but apparently it was never deployed as an operational system. And you can see it might have gotten a little confusing. And fortunately, another alternative came along that I'll discuss in a minute. They also had something called non-directional beacons, and the low frequency range could be augmented with this, and that was a single AM, it was a complex ground installation, but a simple AM receiver on board the airplane. And non-directional beacons have been in use for a very, very long time. There was a parallel development I'll mention, the German Lorenz system. It was ultra short wave, 33 megahertz, and compare that to a GPS at 1575. There were 3 feeds, left, right, and alternately short circuit, and an asymmetrical duty cycle that gave left and right. So it created something that looked like this, looking down on it, and it had an advantage that it created a very narrow beam. And the beam was about a mile at 200 miles. They did some further improvement, but in particular, in this case, they gave a marker beacon at 300 meters and 3 kilometers. So not only did you know you were on the beam, you also had a pretty good feeling when you were approaching and coming very close to the landing point itself, one at 3 kilometers and one at 300 meters. It was first installed at Tempelhof, I guess that's outside Berlin, in 1932. But important to history, it led to a number of German World War II blind bombing aids that were used in 1940 to bomb the cities of the United Kingdom. Well, now that brings us to the VHF omnidirectional range, or VOR. It's considered at that time very high frequency, and that's the name given to that band. And this was 108 to 117 megahertz. It was developed in the United States beginning in 1937, and by 1946, it was deployed and became a worldwide aviation standard. And by 2000, there were about 3,000 of these in the world, 1,000 in the United States. But they have been slowly reduced because of GPS. And I'll give you some more data on that in a minute. These are being decommissioned, but in particular, they don't intend to totally decommission the VOR system. And here's how the VOR looks. I'm not going to go into describing how that dial works, but there are two signals at each station. One is an FM broadcast, and that gives you when the north timing pulse, when the rotating phased array is hitting due north. And your system automatically then times this 30 rotations a second clockwise from the north, which comes across on an AM broadcast. So when you get the peak of that, or if you're considering the right angles, the crossing, the null, you can figure out where you are relative to the VOR station. So in essence, it has 360 radial degrees, and you are determining them without reference to your airplane's attitude, but instead relative to the ground orientation. It also can add voice broadcasts, and the accuracy test, 99.94% of the time, it has an error of less than 0.35 degrees. So again, to calibrate you against 100 nautical miles, the error would be about 0.6 of a nautical mile, but it gets better, of course, as you come closer to the station. And there is a self-monitoring feature to ensure all is well. So now let's turn to another type, and this is perhaps most known to you as Loran, although there used to be a global system called Omega at very low frequencies. What happens with Loran, of course, is a master station sends out a pulse that the user can receive, but is also received by additional stations, shown here as X and Y. And if you look at the time difference between the M and the Y, and there's an extra fixed delay you've got to take out, you are somewhere on a hyperbolic locus, loci, between M and Y, and the green is the loci between X and M, and you're at the intersection, and in many cases you have these more than two slave stations, so there's some built-in redundancy. This was invented actually in England. It's first proposed by this gentleman, Bob Dippy. He was working at Robert Watson Watt's radar laboratory, and it was initially a short-range bombing and landing aid. This gentleman later was an advisor to the United States. Loran A was the first version, and then it became Loran C and D. Now there's another system that is frequently in use called DME, distance measuring equipment, and in this case it can work in one of two ways, either from the ground. Well, let me start out with the user. The user sends out a pulse on a given frequency to a nearby DME station. There's a fixed delay, and then the signal is sent back. So by timing this round trip and multiplying by the speed of light, of course, you get distance, and therefore the user, an airplane in this case, is able to determine that. But it can also be inverted. Air traffic control can locate and identify airplanes by sending its own interrogation and waiting for the transponded or returned signal, and as a result get both an identification of what airplane it is and at least the range to that airplane. The aircraft interrogates the ground transponder with a series of pulse pairs, and the DME receiver in the aircraft searches for a reply. In track mode, you can get very fast update rates. Accuracy is about 1/10 of a nautical mile in the normal operating range. But of course, you can saturate these conceivably. A given DME can handle about 200 aircraft at once. And that leads us to TACAN, which is a combination of VOR and DME. And the military uses these TACANs. The civilians use something called VORTAC VOR. And we have certain stations in the United States that are operating both of these signals at once. And then if we turn it sort of on its side, we can use a pair of these to both get vertical guidance or localizer, glide slope, as well as localizers, azimuths, and as a result we can have guidance for an airplane down to the end of a threshold of a runway. In 1945, 9 of these systems were installed by the U.S. Army, and in 1949, ICAO adopted the Army system as the standard. And again, this is a fly-to needle, so just to keep you on the edge of your seat, it means that those crossing lines are the beam that you should be flying down, and the small circle shown here is what you're actually doing. And then a fifth type is pseudo-range, and I'm not going to explain this because I suspect everyone listening to this talk is well familiar with measuring the timing of 4 incoming signals to determine your position in 4 dimensions, 3 dimensions of geography, if you will, and GPS time to a few nanoseconds. The GPS era, of course, has affected air navigation. The prototype GPS demo was done 1972 to 78. These were the satellites that were placed on orbit during my time as program director. At Stanford, we did the first commercial aircraft line landings in 1992, and the GPS system itself was declared operational by 1994 with full operational capability in 95. Now, interestingly, the FAA, when I first was running the program, said, GPS? This was a question asked in a public meeting. GPS? We don't need it, we don't want it, and if it is ever there, we will never use it. I had some young company grade officers who got very incensed with this, and I said, no, don't worry about it. After we demonstrate what we can do, sooner or later, the FAA will come around, and to their great credit, they have more than come around. They've enthusiastically blended it into what they call next gen. However, that said, they want a backup, and they will continue with VOR DMEs into the indefinite future. They've identified 589 of close to 900 that they will not phase out. The FAA has certified GPS approaches. This is a big deal because then you can officially use GPS to at least get close to an airport. And the high end of that is something they call LPV, that's localizer performance with vertical guidance. And they currently have procedures at 1,950, last time I checked, almost 2,000 airports. And what's really interesting is almost half of those, or over half of those, are airports that don't have the ILS, the older version of a landing system. So these airports are critically enabled by the GPS LPV procedures and approaches. And this shows an approach plate, happens to be for my hometown, San Luis Obispo, that does have an ILS, but it also shows that there is an alternative. And there are also somewhat lesser capability, 725 localizer performance approach procedures serving another 532 airports. So GPS has penetrated the fabric of our air traffic control and air navigation systems to great effect. And I think that is quite a credit to the FAA, and they have done this with caution, and I think that's the right way to do it. Here's an example that was given to me by the chief pilot for United Airlines, and this is a tailored arrival. This is a United Airlines flight coming in from Honolulu and San Francisco. And in the upper center, you can see a sort of a three-dimensional graph of coming in. What's interesting about this is not that it's a curved path, which a radio beam could never do, but that it is also tagged in time. So the operator is not only getting a position as he comes down, he's doing a continuous letdown. So in essence, he puts his engines in idle, and this is a glide path that is comfortable, so you don't have this series of stair steps down that require the reactivation of the engines, maintaining an altitude, and then dropping it down again. Instead, it is a continuous letdown all the way to the end. And these are called tailored arrivals. And this is the actual flight path of a Boeing 747 arriving in San Francisco from Honolulu. Now, what's the big deal? What are the advantages of doing this? Well, this is incorporated into apparently next gen, better safety, less delays, more aircraft capacity, smaller fuel and carbon footprint. Let's quantify that. The average fuel saved, according to my friend, was 1,600 pounds, almost a ton of fuel. Now, of course, all airplanes are not 747s and all flights are not this example, but there are over 28,000 commercial flights in the U.S. per day, or at least there were before the COVID thing, and you can easily see there was quite an improvement. So a little more on where GPS is going. Of course, you are all aware PNT is going to explode with opportunities. It's only really L1CA is the main signal, but the next generation has 4 new signals at 2 new frequencies. I'm particularly enthusiastic about the FAA's L5 signal. GLONASS, 4 new civil signals at 2 frequencies. Galileo, next generation, 4 new civil signals at 2 new frequencies. Compass has declared its operation, and in addition, we've got regional systems such as QZSS and the Indian system. So there are 10 new civil signals, including a new international signal we've called L1C. Hopefully they will provide interchangeability for all navigation satellite signals, and there will be something like 100 satellites on orbit. So the result for the user, better accuracy, availability, and integrity. So this brings me to the end of what I wanted to talk about, some final observations. The history of radio navigation is really rich, and it deserves a much greater treatment than I've given it here today. I am particularly enthusiastic about what Marconi did as an early conceptualizer. We take a little pride in the fact that most international systems are traceable to US in their initial operation, but many other countries have invented or developed basic concepts and technology. It's interesting also to note that the largest investor in supporter of radio navigation research and development up to this point has been the military. And if you know me at all, GPS is great, but we still need to protect the frequency bands, to toughen our receivers, and to augment those receivers with other systems and signals, inertials, you name it, to make certain that the user always has assured PNT. So let me wrap it up by returning to our motivation. Transportation fatalities. Here's the status roughly today. If you recall the difference between what the death rate was in 1929 to the death rate today, 0.06 deaths per billion miles traveled, a factor, I think, of roughly 10,000 improvement. Of course, that's due to many factors, including maintenance of engines and the like, but certainly air navigation has a prominent credit that should be given for what they have done. Safer skies. And those of us who drive long distances, you know, maybe we should be a little bit concerned. The cars and trucks deaths per billion miles traveled, many, many times greater than air travel. And so people who are afraid of traveling in the air and instead take a car, I don't think they understand statistics very well. So that concludes my remarks. Thank you very much. I will stand by for questions, and I appreciated taking your time to give you this discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Parkinson, for that really fascinating presentation. I certainly appreciated the historical look of the development of radio navigation. So as he has mentioned, he's available to take some questions. So just place your questions in the question and answer section, and I'll read them back to Brad as they come through. So we have a couple of questions already. The first one actually comes from, I'm sorry, I won't be able to pronounce the first name, but I'm just going to say it's Lax Harayit Tom. He says he loves your presentation. He would like to ask you to comment on an article that was published in IEEE Proceedings in 1988. Sir J.C. Bowes diode detector received Marconi's first transatlantic wireless signal of December 1901, something known as the Italian Navy Coherer. Scandal revisited. Can you comment on that, Brad?
I'm not familiar. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to answer a few questions. I'm not familiar with that particular publication. IEEE publishes a lot of things, but let me just say that the controversy that repeatedly came out regarding Marconi was that all the calculations, in essence, using Maxwell's equations, said you couldn't possibly have made that transmission and reception. And there were a number of devices that were used. The coherer is, I'm digging way back into my youth here. The coherer was a device, as I recall it, that would, based on sensing a certain frequency, allow it to cohere some small particles and show that you had a signal. Now, I don't remember all the details of that, so I'm afraid I didn't give you a very good answer.
Thank you for commenting. I'm going to look that up too. It sounds interesting. Another question here is from John Lavrakis. Thanks for a fascinating talk. This shared a part of navigation history I'd never heard. My question, GPS has some big improvements in the future, which could also be viewed as bumps in the road like OCX, managing multiple signals and solving message authentication. But there are other GNSS offering parallel services. What risks do you see for GPS remaining as what itself describes as the gold standard?
Well, first let me say that's a good question. I'm not terribly fond of the use of the term gold standard. It implies a competition rather than a cooperation. I don't despair as to whether GPS will be the leader. I despair if the United States is not investing in the future. We are investing, of course, with L5. That signal, if you get into the details, has been extremely well designed. And if you look back, we've stuck with CA for 46 years. And CA has been the mainstay. But if you look at this signal, not only is it higher in power, there are some who lament that, but it has a couple of very interesting features, including the fact that it has greater processing gain. So it is inherently more resistive to interference, and at the same time, it promises to be in a band, the ARNS band, which is totally protected, and hopefully we'll never get into another legato controversy. Let's see, there was another aspect to your question. Would you give me there was another aspect to that question that I didn't.
I'll just read the last part of it. GPS has some big improvements in the future, which could also be viewed as bumps in the road, like OCX.
Oh, the OCX problem. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize what was going on with OCX, and I'm not going to end up discussing that in any detail, but I will tell you this. OCX took on a heavy load, not only with trying to solve the problem of controlling the satellites, they also had a massive upgrade in the security of the system. And as I understand it, it was trying to put in watertight, we'll call it, security that has led to a lot of these delays. It sounds like they're on the right track. I certainly hope they are, but you're right to be concerned. But the concern would be equally had they not addressed the security problems for something as critical as the control of GPS satellites.
Thank you. Got a few more questions for you. This one's from Joseph Raleigh. L5 is a third civilian GPS signal designed to meet demanding requirements for safety of life transportation and other high performance applications. What is so unique about the L5 signal, and why will it improve safety of flight and over the current L1 signal?
Well, first of all, it gives redundancy, of course, a clear, real redundancy to L1CA. It's operating in a modestly different band. It has a design that I just mentioned that has greater processing gain. It has greater protection from the FCC. And I tell you what you're seeing now. I understand that they are producing chips for your telephone that will receive both L1 and L5. So not only do you have the redundancy, you have the direct correction for ionospheric group delay using the TGD calculation that you're all familiar with probably. So I'm a big advocate for L5, and I totally get it, I hope.
Thank you. Another question from Christopher Marshall. Thank you, Dr. Parkinson, for this talk. We're partway through the process of developing an SBOS for Australia and New Zealand. We've been exploring L1, L2, L5 signal combinations for all sectors of industry, of course, including aviation. Have you noted any interesting use cases that WAS has enabled aside from aerodrome approaches?
Well, WAS, the primary purpose of WAS, although what I love is the correction to any residual errors, any residual natural errors that gives you accuracy, but that isn't the real reason for WAS. The real reason for WAS, of course, is integrity. So any operation you have that demands that your PNT solution be truthful is going to have great joy and a confirmation with a WAS-like signal, which gives you 6 seconds time to alarm. And at the time when we first got into landing airplanes and all that at Stanford, we got into the WAS, and frankly, it was initially called wide area differential GPS because my main motivation was the accuracy. But the FAA sort of jerked me up short. They've been keeping us funded, keeping a lot of students in doctoral programs. But they said, wait a minute, the real issue is integrity. Can we trust it at all? And I have come around 100%. I totally get it. 100%. What the WAS does, first of all, it tells you if one of those signals is lying. And if you've got a good receiver, as soon as it hears there's a problem on one of those signals, it clips it off. So the big payoff to me from WAS is the integrity. But I do love the accuracy too.
For sure. In a safety of life application such as commercial air flight, of course, the integrity I think is quite important, and accuracy, of course. But that integrity, I think they absolutely needed. A couple more questions for you from Frank Shopek. Great talk. My wife noticed that your 12-ship Titanic chart only displayed 10 ships. Where were the other 2 ships? Now you know, Frank, right? Where were the other 2 ships and what were their names?
Oh, that is a typical. Thank you, Frank, for that question. I don't honestly know, and I did not count them. And I have to commend your wife for pulling us up a little short. The graphic, of course, was directly out of a magazine of 108 years ago. And if we could call the editor, maybe we could ask them.
Thank you. Okay, another question from, oops, it went off my screen, from Demetrios Matsakis. Do you have an opinion on the controversy over whether it was Tesla who invented wireless communication first?
I don't have I don't have an authoritative way to tell you anything about that. I know they were both experimenting at about the same time. I think Marconi, for whatever reason, evidently was able to get a commercial edge and get his ideas out there. But candidly, those ideas would have gone nowhere had it not been for Braun and his inductive coupling to that antenna. Because frankly, the process that was being used by Marconi initially was just too inefficient. And Marconi was not a theoretical person. He was pure experimentalist. And if you read, and I've read 2 or 3 books of his biography for a different reason. I'm associated with the Marconi Society. If you read those, it's clear that when he gave that credit that I showed in that lecture to the other the theory people, it was well placed, and I have to give him a lot of credit in turn for acknowledging who his predecessors and cohorts were. So I don't know that I would want to single out between Tesla and Marconi, one or the other, as being the absolute person who did it all.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions. This one from Kriti Mahanti. Thanks for the talk. I would like to know the present research status of integrating signals from different GNSS into a single receiver. It improves signal availability. Does it improve positioning?
It improves if all systems are working together. It improves accuracy somewhat, but the real improvement is integrity. And there has been extensive study of that with what we call self-integrity, RAIN, pioneered by Penny Axelrad, by the way. But these techniques use multiple ranges and cross-check to determine whether one of them is bad. And so you can do that without a WAS signal. So certainly that in itself is a major advantage. Now, in terms of research, the fascinating thing to me is, you see this? That's a cell phone. The latest chips, I don't know what all is in this one, but the latest chips, I am told, not only do all 4 of the major constellations, and I think the major supplements as well, EGNOS and WAS, and perhaps the Indian, forgetting the name of it, things. But the point is, the technology to do that is being enabled right now at I don't know, a fraction of $10 and put into these kind of devices. Not only that, they are also, I got to turn just a minute. Not only that, they are also able to do real-time kinematic, because these are now carrier tracking devices. To me, this is totally astounding, and it's opening up a whole new plethora of possible applications. And the basic engine, the technology behind that basic engine are already with us today.
Very good. Thank you. Can you take a couple more questions?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Let's see. This is from Jian Yao. This presentation is so inspiring. Looking forward to the far future. Do you envision any navigation system that can replace GNSS? The future navigation may no longer depend on radio frequency or even time of arrival.
Yeah, well, I have a confession. And that confession is I am not a radio navigation person. See, I was trained at MIT. I actually worked in Doc Draper's lab and spent the first 3 years after I did that and got a master's degree at Holloman. I was a chief analyst for inertial navigation testing for the Air Force. And I hear a lot of people say, well, we'll just get an inertial, a really good one, and it will replace the radio nav. It'll never happen. Never, ever happen. And there are some fundamental reasons it will not happen. In particular, almost everything an inertial navigation device does is a double integration of something that's being sensed. The slightest amount of bias in that will have errors growing as time and time squared. So the sensible question is not that. I don't want to criticize the question, but the sensible thing is a marriage between inertial navigation and radio navigation, using inertial navigation to both make the radio receiver more robust and also to be able to cruise through periods when it isn't available. So I don't regard it as an either or. I don't regard it as a competition. And by the way, as the cost of inertial components has gone down and their capabilities have gone up, incidentally, a lot of that being done in Draper Labs and other places, it does nothing but enhance our basic purpose as a society, as the Institute of Navigation. Our basic purpose is not GPS. It is position, navigation, and time for our users. And I think keeping that in mind puts us on the right course.
Thank you. Another question from Felipe Pereira. Great talk. What are your views on the long-term sustainability of GNSS orbits and the continuing use of graveyard orbits at satellite end of life?
I've got to tell you, I'm very concerned. I'm concerned. I'm more concerned in LEOs because, but LEOs, if they're low LEOs, have an advantage because there is enough drag to eventually pull them down. But at our orbits, there's nothing that's going to pull them down in any reasonable period of time. And of course, when we initially did it, I had a concern as a program director. So our technique was to boost them into a higher orbit. If we could have afforded it at the time, as you know, it is cheaper at our orbits, cheaper from the standpoint of fuel, to throw a used GPS satellite into solar orbit away from our influence than it is to drop it down into the atmosphere. I think that eventually we're going to have to go to this. I mean, if you think of this accumulating for hundreds of years, it's a really terrible, terrible thing to do. It's a junkyard in which nothing is rusting. It is staying up there forever. So I agree with the concern. I don't have a simple answer, but were I king, I would say all satellites have to either deorbit and plunge into the atmosphere or have to extra orbit and go into an orbit around the sun. By the way, one of the favorite subjects I ever taught was space mechanics. I just love space mechanics. So mathematical.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure our previous speaker would appreciate that as well.
Yes, and by the way, she gave a great talk. I really enjoyed where she was heading.
Thank you. I'm glad. I hope everyone enjoyed both of you speakers. I think you were fantastic. Okay, maybe one more question since it is 9:40 and people are probably getting tired. This one. No,
it's not. It's only 6:40.
Oh, depends on where we sit. Well, I could go on because there are more questions here. So Srinu Chidamalia, what would be the alternative to the global positioning services if there was any pandemic and the radioactivity of the space that disturbs the GNSS signals? So what's the backup if we have a major solar storm?
Well, I'll tell you the backup I always use, and it has a simple acronym, MAPS.
Okay. That's our backup.
No, it's a good question. I will tell you the GPS satellites are very, very hard. They are very robust against radiation, and whether such an event could conceivably take them out or merely give them a short interruption, I don't know. But my guess is that if there were an event of such a magnitude, a solar expulsion of material or whatever that would totally and permanently take out GPS satellites, the problems here on Earth would be much greater than where you are.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, for sure. I work in space weather, and I know what you're talking about. Here's another question for you from Ling Zhao. Thanks for the talk. How do you envision the navigation in 30 years from now? You think it'll be GPS-based, LiDAR, or INS?
It's going to have as a backbone, in my opinion, GPS or GNSS to be more broad and understanding. And they've looked for alternatives. I mean, the United States is frantically trying to find an augmentation system that could take over. They have not found one. They have found ones that will get you through under certain circumstances, and I'm an advocate for them. But the advantage of space in terms of going to radio frequencies that have very high precision because of their frequency, but hence line of sight, because that's the way it works, and the visibility to completely cover the Earth, it's very difficult to beat that. And I led a task force that examined ELORAN. I went in as a skeptic and came out convinced that it was a viable backup. It probably is not the only one. There's a lot of trade-offs. Certainly low Earth satellites are also feasible, comm satellites, targets of opportunity. But none of those, unless they are very similar in how they look to a GPS satellite, are going to do the job. And the reason we aren't closer to the Earth, we did a trade-off in terms of how high we could throw a satellite. Gaylord Green was the satellite program manager that worked for me. Excellent man, by the way, and well known to the ION. But that trade-off says we're at about the sweet altitude. In terms of coverage, you can't go a whole heck of a lot higher, and you're going to be in outer space, or you're going to be going around the sun or something. And if you go a lot lower, you start to have to add satellites to get the kind of coverage and redundancy we have today. So it's a trade-off.
Okay. All right. Well, I thank you for answering all of those questions. There are a couple of other comments. Most of them a great talk, Brad. So everyone really enjoyed your presentation for sure. So on behalf of the Institute of Navigation, I want to thank our speakers, Dr. Brad Parkinson, Dr. Christine Darden, for your fascinating presentations this evening. I also want to thank our audience for joining us. We're broadcasting across the world tonight. At one point in time, I think we had well over 230 participants listening in. Our only regret really is that we could not join all of you in person. Finally, we hope you enjoy the virtual program this week. Make sure you check in on the news on the virtual program for all the news and announcements as we get through the week, as we all stay safe in this virtual mode. Let's hope this is the last time we have to meet virtually. So with that, I'll end this plenary session, and thank you all once again for participating. Thank you.
Well done, Pat. Well done.
Good night, everyone.